All right, I think we are ready to start after the coffee break. I am now switching into English because our lecturer, our first keynote speaker is Dr. Laury Robinson from Acadia University. And Laura will talk to us today about very interesting subject. But firstly, I would love to welcome her. Hello, Laura, again. So here we are at our conference, and very happy to have you here. Perhaps some of you may know that it wasn't so sure that Laura will be here today with us because of the Fiona hurricane, which struck the eastern coast of Atlantic shores of Canada quite hard. But we are so very happy that you could manage it, that everything is working. So Dr. Laury Robinson is the interim vice provost, teaching and learning excellence, and professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Former visiting scholar at the Montgomery Institute at the University of Prince Edward Island, she has published many articles on Montgomery's work. With E. Holly Pike, she edited the book Montgomery and Gender. It came out the last year. She also acted as a consultant on Historica Canada, Montgomery Heritage Minute, and the Inspiring Places, Montgomery Literary Tour in PEI, and she created the traveling exhibition, The Canadian Homefront, Montgomery's Reflections on the First World War. So, Laura, the floor or the screen actually is yours, and the title of the lecture, which is actually killed, but I will read it. It's All Right with the Word, reading Anne of Green Gables backwards. So, yes, and I'm moving the camera just now, so you can see that.
Oh, yes. Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to your conference that's celebrating the translation of Anne of Green Gables into Polish. And a special thank you to Alexandra. It is a great honor to be here today virtually. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the land I'm on, as we do in Canada. I'm coming to you today from Acadia University, which is in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I share this with you in order to take a small step towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and to honor the treaties of peace and friendship from our region. And I'd also like to say some words to others in my region of Atlantic Canada, which has just been hit, as Alexandra pointed out, by a very powerful hurricane. In our area of Nova Scotia, we managed to escape much damage, but in many areas, and some of you may have seen the pictures, were hit very hard. In Montgomery's homeland of Prince Edward Island, the landscape has been forever changed, including the dunes on Cavendish Beach. They've just been completely washed away. So thank you for allowing me to share those words. So as you can see, my paper is called All's Right with the World, reading Anne of Green Gables backwards. And about a year ago, I gave a short talk to Acadia University's Alumni Association on whether the character of Anne was a conservative icon or a stealth feminist, a discussion that Cecily Devereaux engages in her introduction to Broadview Press's Anne of Green Gables. I'm going to start with this question today, but I will ultimately show you that reading backwards from the last line of Anne of Green Gables, and also from one of the adaptations, Anne with an E, we can see much more clearly the progressiveness of this beloved novel. In my opinion, Anne is definitely a stealth feminist, and by reading backwards, we can perhaps see how much of a feminist Montgomery was, and what a radical critique she was offering up. So, Anne of Green Gables, conservative icon or stealth feminist? Well, some readers argue that the iconic Anne capitulates to the social dictates around her. Others have regarded her as a feminist figure, breaking new ground for girls and women. I will first show how Montgomery subtly rewrites traditional stories to allow Anne to have agency while not isolating her from her community. And I'll be interested in hearing from you how the Polish translations follow this trajectory. And I just heard from Alexandra that people have looked at Chinese and Slovakian translations as well. So it'll be an interesting discussion. So these are the things I'll be discussing this afternoon, morning here for me, afternoon there. A brief background on Montgomery, a background on Anne of Green Gables, We'll talk about Montgomery and gender roles. We'll talk about the genre, the girl's story and the female Bildungsroman, Anne of Green Gables and gender roles, and then reading backwards, Pippa Passes and Anne with an E. So a background on Montgomery. Many of you know the background, but just a little refresher. She was born in Clifton, PEI on the 30th of November, 1874. Her mother died when she was 21 months old, and she was raised by maternal grandparents, Alexander and Lucy McNeil in Cavendish, PEI. And I will note here that all the photographs of Montgomery and her life that I'm using are from the University of Guelph archives. She began writing when she was young and published quite a few poems and short stories. In 1907, she received notice that a manuscript had been accepted for publication. That was Anne of Green Gables, of course, which was published in 1908 by an American publisher. And more on that in a second. She agreed to marry Reverend Ewan MacDonald in 1906. Pretty handsome fella, isn't he? Before she got her acceptance from the publisher. And they married in 1911. And it was not a particularly happy marriage. And I'm really happy to discuss this in the discussion period if you're interested in hearing more. So the background on Anne of Green Gables. Montgomery's manuscript faced several rejections at first, but when it was finally published in 1908, it became an instant bestseller, lauded by almost everyone, including American writer Mark Twain. Montgomery produced a series of 8 books in total about Anne's life. So do note that the publication dates, which follow the titles of the books, are not in the same order of Anne's life. So we can discuss that later. She went back to filling gaps in Anne's chronology. The latest number on the first novel, Anne, are 50 million copies published worldwide, translated into at least 36 languages, such as Polish, as well as Braille. The most recent translation was in 2020, and that was Gaelic. It has been adapted more than 24 times in various mediums, recently a ballet here in Canada. Some of you may be acquainted with the Polish television series from 1958, which I'd love to see someday. And so Anne of Green Gables has been considered often popular rather than highbrow by the literary establishment. It's written by a woman about girls and women and about rural Canada at that. It was at best overlooked, but often outright denigrated by scholars and critics, until the 1980s brought feminist literary criticism to the fore. And this kind of scholarship reassessed women's writing. And Montgomery experienced a renewed surge of popularity because of new critical attention. And also the Sullivan made-for-TV movies. I'm not sure if you are aware of those in Poland. And the publication of Montgomery's journals was a big part of this. In 1993, Elizabeth Epperly established the Ella Montgomery Institute at the University of Prince Edward Island, and in 1994 hosted the first of the ongoing biennial international Ella Montgomery conferences that are still going on, and I just met Alexandra there this past June. Of course, Anne is beloved by millions all over the world and has never been out of print. People make pilgrimages to PEI. There's a tourism industry and many, many products. Anne equals a multi-million-dollar tourist industry and merchandise. And what you see here is the heirs of Ella Montgomery Inc. They incorporated. Tourism PEI has a vested interest. Avonlea Traditions, which is a company that runs out of Ontario that sells the dolls and things like that. And then the Anne of Green Gables Licensing Authority, which brings together a lot of the people with vested interest to oversee the industry. And I'm happy to discuss that later as well. So Montgomery and gender roles. One of the questions I always ask is, why do we keep retelling and rereading her stories? Why are so many different cultures and time periods interested in this irrepressible red-headed orphan? And it might just be due in part to her fascinating and on the surface subtle battle with gender roles. as relevant in this Me Too era. And I looked this up. There is a hashtag Ja Tezaz for Me Too in Poland. Sorry for my pronunciation. I'm sure it's not accurate, but is relevant now as it was in 1908. So this is why I think her background's important. As a girl raised by proper Presbyterian grandparents in rural Prince Edward Island, and then as a Presbyterian minister's wife, Montgomery was certainly aware that open rebellion against gender constraints, while possible, was not advisable. Publicly, she often voiced conservative views. In 1910, for instance, she told a Boston reporter, "I am not a suffragette," adding, "I believe a woman's place is in the home." Far from being a woman who stays at home, however, Montgomery spoke as a writer already famous for Anne of Green Gables, even though she may have wanted to protect her image by stating such conservative beliefs. That deft and subtle irony is Montgomery's trademark. While not necessarily an outspoken advocate for women's rights, Montgomery worked assiduously to tell women's stories and highlight domestic heroism in her tales, including her copious journals. Devereux points out that, and this is quotation, Anne should be understood in relation to the principles of feminism of the so-called first wave, or loosely, the period between the 1870s and the 1930s. And this is a maternal feminism. It's a feminism that valued motherhood and the perpetuation of race and empire, both physically and ideologically, regarding the mother as the central figure in both. That notwithstanding, I'm going to suggest that we can see a more radical critique of society from Montgomery, one that doesn't necessarily uphold these traditional gender roles, and we can see this by reading backwards. At the same time, she revalues those domestic roles, but without exalting them. And I think that's an important difference with maternal feminism. Montgomery's legacy of 20 novels published in her lifetime and a multitude of stories repeatedly constructs girls and women who live, for the most part, in a feminine utopia, in the words of Eve Kornfeld and Susan Jackson, a world largely populated by girls and women. Most famous, of course, is the lovable Anne, a character who has influenced generations of writers, such as, in Canada, Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro, and Jane Urquhart. While not a feminist trailblazer, as Nora Kaplan-Brickner points out in an article in Slate.com, Anne is a stealth feminist, to borrow Chloe Angel's very apt words. Stealth is definitely Montgomery's style. Unlike the boyish rebel Jo March of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, Anne does not rail against being a girl. Indeed, many of Anne's scrapes ensue from her ardent attempts to fulfill an impossible feminine ideal. She dyes her hair green because she wanted it to be beautiful raven black, and she puts real flowers in her hair, shocking churchgoers because they aren't the standard fake ones. Most starkly, Montgomery sets the stage at the outset, Anne as the devalued, unwanted gender. All Anne wants is to belong at Green Gables, but she's not the boy the aging Cuthbert siblings requested to help them work the farm. Unwanted as she initially is, Anne gradually wins her community over through her lively personality, her strong work ethic, and her commitment to academic study. By novel's end, woman-dreading Matthew Cuthbert voices a turnaround in the novel's gender politics. When Anne laments not being a boy so she could help him labor in the fields, he responds, "Well now, I'd rather have you than a dozen boys, Anne." Through her characters, Anne, but also Emily, Jane, Pat, and Montgomery's other heroines, Montgomery convinces her reader that some amount of change is possible, that girls and women can be valued intrinsically. And I think that girls' books like Anne of Green Gables are extremely important for scholars to look at because generations of women read them, and men, and identify strongly with the heroines, use the heroines in their experiences to make sense of their own lives, just as Anne does. Anne of Green Gables teaches readers how to have their cake and eat it too, how to get away with not just capitulating to expectations that expose limitations on them. So the genre that we're working with here is the girl stories and the female Bildungsroman. At the time Anne of Green Gables came out, girls' stories were in the process of becoming a phenomenon. These are largely Bildungsroman, or novels about young people coming of age. Of course, Bildungsroman with female protagonists were quite different from those with male protagonists. Boys tend to grow upwards and outwards, leaving home and having adventures, whereas girls' stories most frequently end in marriage. Girls' stories or female Bildungsroman that you might know, and I have some pictures up here. Little Women, the American one. The Daisy Chain is a famous British one. Pollyanna, Rebecca of Summerbrook Farm came before Anne of Green Gables, Heidi, and Pippi Longstocking. Elizabeth Segal talks about these types of books and the structure of them. She writes, these are books designed to persuade the young reader to accept the confinement and self-sacrifice inherent in the doctrine of feminine influence. In the girl's book, the protagonist who resists the dictates of genteel femininity must be tamed, her will broken to accept a submissive and sedentary role. The so-called happy ending of such books is that she herself stops rebelling and chooses the approved role in order to gain or retain the love and approval of those around her. Annis Pratt wrote a book called Archetypal Patterns in Women's Fiction, and she has this to say about the female Bildungsroman. In this most conservative branch of the women's Bildungsroman, then, we find a genre that pursues the opposite of its generic intent. It provides models for growing down rather than for growing up. In the Bildungsroman proper, with its expectations that the hero is learning to be adult, there is the hidden agenda of gender norms, where adult means learning to be dependent, submissive, or non-adult. So girls and women tend to lose power as they get older because they have to behave more childlike in order to adhere to proper gender roles. The novel of development portrays a world in which the young woman hero is destined for disappointment. The vitality and hopefulness characterizing the adolescent hero's attitude towards her future here meet and conflict with the expectations and dictates of surrounding society. So that's Annis Pratt. So most frequently what we see is a feisty, tomboyish heroine who has scrapes and scrapes until she's successfully tamed at the end. And the iconic one of these figures is Jo March in Little Women. Feminist critics have lamented this capitulation, what they are terming capitulation, to pressures to conform at the end of these books. I tend to focus more on the rest of the narrative, which encodes and seems to promote rebelliousness, regardless of the ending. The first words in Anne of Green Gables set us up for Anne's development to be typical of the other heroines. Very first words. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed by a brook that had its source way back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and children up. And that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. Anne Wilby, the novel, seems to indicate like the headlong brook that learns to become well conducted under the sharp gaze of Mrs. Lynde. Anne's best friend, Diana, has a growing down trajectory that Montgomery sets up as a foil. She has some freedom as a child, but her parents don't want her reading too much, and they refuse to provide the extra education Anne receives. Diana is destined only for submissive and marriageable womanhood. She becomes that well-conducted stream. By creating Diane as a comparator, Montgomery highlights Anne's difference. And Anne sure is different, as we all know. Montgomery highlights gender as a central issue, as I mentioned. Anne is not wanted at Green Gables initially because she is a girl. Therefore, the entire text centers on revaluing and gaining acceptance for girlhood. Unlike other girl stories, Anne is not very tomboyish. All she wants is to be a girly girl. Excuse me. She poses a question to a bewildered Matthew right before she meets him. Which would you rather be if you had the choice? Divinely beautiful, or dazzlingly clever, or angelically good? All three of these are arguably traditionally feminine, although she would prefer to be the more feminine options of beautiful or good. She gets into scrapes because of her desires to be feminine. As I mentioned, she wears real flowers to her hair for church. She longs for puff sleeves on her dress. Montgomery's narrator draws attention to how different Anne is from other storybook girls when she has to get her hair cut off because she dyed it green rather than the raven black she was hoping for. These are images from the CBC Kevin Sullivan production of Anne of Green Gables. She says, "This is such an unromantic affliction. The girls in books lose their hair in fevers or sell it to get money for some good deed. And I'm sure I wouldn't mind losing my hair in some such fashion half so much. But there is nothing comforting in having your hair cut off because you've dyed it a dreadful color, is there?" Of course, we know that Jo March in Little Women cuts off her chestnut mane, her only good feature, other characters are quick to point out, in order to raise funds for her father, who's fallen ill on the front lines of the Civil War. Anne's development does seem to lend itself to being reined in or tamed. Marilla wants to tame her, and this is a quotation. Marilla conceived it to be her duty to drill Anne into a tranquil uniformity of disposition, as impossible and alien to her as to a dancing sunbeam in one of the brook's shallows. She did not make much headway, as she sorrowfully admitted to herself. The downfall of some dear hope or plan plunged Anne into the depths of affliction. Unquote. Oh, sorry, no, we'll carry on here in the quotation. The fulfillment thereof exalted her to dizzy realms of delight. Marilla had almost begun to despair of ever fashioning this waif of the world into her model little girl of demure manners and prim deportment. Neither would she have believed that she really liked Anne much better as she was. Like Marilla, the reader loves Anne precisely because she is not a model girl. In fact, she's modeling a different kind of girlhood. And Anne changes over the course of the novel, and arguably in all the adaptations as well. There were other, and this is a quotation, there were other changes in Anne. Sorry, this is me saying this. There were other changes in Anne, no less real than the physical change. So she becomes quieter, and she, oh, sorry, that is a quotation. There were other changes in Anne, no less real than the physical change. For one thing, she became quieter. Perhaps she thought all the more and dreamed as much as ever, but she certainly talked less. So Marilla notices this and says to her, "You don't chatter half as much as you used to, Anne, nor use half as many big words. What has come over you?" So Marilla is distressed by Anne's change, even though she wished her to change. And then says, "I was wishing you could have stayed a little girl, even with your queer ways. You've grown up now and you're going away, and you look so tall and stylish and so different altogether in that dress, as if you didn't belong in Avonlea at all, and I just got lonesome thinking it all over." And Anne responds to her with this: "I'm not a bit changed, not really. I'm only just pruned down and branched out. The real me back here is just the same. It won't make a bit of difference where I go or how much I change outwardly. At heart, I shall always be your little Anne." And I feel that that is key here. Anne learns not to get into as many scrapes, but she is still the feisty heroine that we know and love. Indeed, as Susan Drain has pointed out, the people who change in this novel are Marilla and Matthew and the town of Avonlea. Marilla learns to lighten up and have a sense of humor over the course of the novel, and to love. Mrs. Rachel Lynde exclaims, Marilla Cuthbert has got mellow, that's what. When Anne is out in the fields with Matthew and sees he's not doing too well physically, she said, "If I had been the boy you sent for," said Anne wistfully, "I'd be able to help you so much now and spare you in 100 ways. I could find it in my heart to wish I had been, just for that." And as I mentioned before, he responds and says, "Well, now, I'd rather have you than a dozen boys, Anne," said Matthew, patting her hand, just mind you that, rather than a dozen boys. Well, now, I guess it wasn't a boy that took the Avery Scholarship, was it? It was a girl, my girl that I'm proud of. To me, this is the moment of acceptance. The whole force of the novel has been to revision and revalue girlhood. Of course, Matthew then dies. Sorry, spoiler alert. You all know. And Anne must relinquish her scholarship and university to stay at home to save Green Gables. Now, some feminist scholars have seen Anne's sacrifice of her scholarship as giving up her own desires, as giving in to social pressure, to domesticity. The narrative leads us to the place where Anne has to give up her own desires and stay home. However, while this is her duty, Anne gets what she always wanted in this moment, a home. Green Gables. The power shifts. Rather than her staying at Green Gables conditionally and then Marilla looking after her, she looks after Marilla. Marilla can only stay at Green Gables if Anne does. And Anne declares that she's still going to study her arts program at home. So what about the romance between Anne and Gilbert? Is it too conventional, or is Montgomery up to something here as well? Well, readers often read Anne's feelings as a disguised crush on Gilbert. I kind of flip this and see that the crush is Montgomery's way to disguise or mitigate Anne's ambition. From the moment Anne kind of righteously breaks her slate over Gilbert's head for calling her carrots, she refuses to engage in a relationship with him. However, the narrative makes clear that he's the center of many of her thoughts. When she has to miss school, she's upset because Gil, the others will get ahead of her. And so that's one moment. But this catching herself about to name Gilbert occurs multiple times in the text. And I see this as Montgomery cloaking Anne's ambition in the discourse of romance. The narrative seems to suggest that Anne's not really ambitious, just fired up about Gilbert. But let's face it, Anne is really ambitious. So far I've presented a neat and tidy reading about Anne finding acceptance in her community and a home, and Montgomery's novel subtly working to revalue girls' and women's role in society. And I believe this reading stands. But what if we start with the last lines of the book and reread the novel through the lens of those? My argument is that we emerge with an even more progressive, dare we say radical, reading of Montgomery's novel. Montgomery is rendering a lot of criticisms in a deft and subtle way. So, in the last lines of the book, Anne whispers the lines from Robert Browning's 1841 drama, Pippa Passes, to herself, ostensibly feeling content and comfortable. And these are the last words of the novel. And the last very words that Anne says, and she's speaking, so that's kind of empowering. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. So it sounds very reassuring and peaceful, doesn't it? Very worldly and godly. Only in Browning's drama, nothing at all is right with the world, even though Pippa thinks it may be. And absolutely nothing is right with Pippa's world, and she knows it. So here's the storyline from Victorian Web, which I think is typical of how this drama is summed up. So Pippa's a young, innocent textile worker on her one day off a year, and this is from Victorian Web now. As she wanders the streets on her annual holiday, she brushes shoulders with pimps, prostitutes, debauched students, informers, hired assassins, and parasites of every variety. Her immunity to worldly degradation lies in her very unworldliness, She is a child of nature, unlettered, inexperienced, guileless, endowed only with a happy disposition, innocence, and the wisdom of her intuitions, unquote. So that's kind of typical of how people read Pippa's passages, but I actually think that Browning's drama is way more complicated and profound than that. And you can be sure that Montgomery knew the drama. She had the works of Browning in her collection. And so using these final words weren't an unintentional irony on her part, wasn't an unintentional irony. And because Pippa Passes was met with no small controversy on its publication, it's even more likely that folks, including Montgomery, knew the complicated and sordid content. The words are deeply ironic in Browning because we know that all is not right with the world. And it is an irony that Anne, in all her innocence, repeats these lines. The disturbing context, the poem from which they originate, calls into question how right everything really is for Anne. It gives Montgomery's novel a much darker hue. In looking for Anne, Irena Gamel cites Montgomery's journal of the 8th of November, 1905. Gamel imagines that this is a moment that Montgomery is writing Anne of Green Gables, even though in that entry she's despairing about having nothing to write about. But this is the lines from the journal. I look at my rose and I think, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. It is a song and hope and a prayer all in one. So then Gamel writes, for Maud, the little song was not a naive affirmation of a perfect world, but a prayer for a better one. Anxious and worried, she used such mantras during the difficult times in her life. So Gamel sees Montgomery as putting this mantra into Anne's mouth as her, quote, own inspirational incantation during times of distress. While Gamel's assessment skims the surface of the content of Browning's work, she does interestingly land with the conclusion that the final words of the novel express Anne's distress, even if she doesn't take that further. In the Fragments of Sweetgrass, Elizabeth Epperly embraces the complexity of this line to a greater extent. And these are her words. The line is often quoted as though it is a purely ecstatic expression of well-being, and it is, but it is meant to be appreciated in the context of the danger around the unsuspecting Pippa. The line is a reminder to readers and to those who hear Pippa within the poem that good may be powerful, but it is constantly threatened. Anne's quotation expresses Anne's determination as well as her happiness. So Epperly sees using this quotation at the end of the novel as a warning from Montgomery, and I quite agree. So let's back up and unpack Browning's poetic drama in order to look at the context of those words. Because Anne is repeating those words, which are Pippa's, she occupies the same role as Pippa, and then perhaps we, her readers, represent the so-called happy people she passes by on her day off. So stay with me here while I dig into Browning. I promise to bring it back to Anne. So Browning's drama is organized into 5 acts: the introduction, morning, noon, evening, and night. In the introduction, the young laborer in a silk mill, Pippa, rises in her very drab chamber on her one day off a year, filled with joy that she's able to walk the city of Asolo and imagine herself sharing the happiness of what she calls Asolo's 4 happiest ones. Act 1, morning, shows us the first of those, Ottima, who has been cheating on her elderly husband, Luca, with the young tutor, Sibbald. While Pippa imagines the wealthy Ottima happy in all her loves and her wealth, as Luca owns 10 silk mills, including the one in which Pippa works, Sibbald has just murdered Luca, and the two are discussing the murder and their love. Then Pippa passes, singing the most famous song from the drama. The years at the spring and days at the morn, mornings at 7, the hillsides dew-pearled, the larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Hearing this ragged girl, that's how she's described, Sibbald is suddenly struck with regret and compunction. he shifts radically from love to hate for Adama. There is some disagreement about what happens next, but in my reading, Sibbald is poised to kill Adama and then himself as a means to atone for what he's done. The next act, New, shows us the pompous and hated sculpture Jules emerging from his nuptials with Fene. Hated by his fellow scholars and artists, who are not good people themselves, he has been tricked into marrying the 14-year-old prostitute who has yet to even speak to him. He's a Pygmalion figure, sculpting this ideal woman and falling in love with his creation. When Fene begins to speak the words she was trained to speak, she goes off script and reveals the trickery and her circumstances as a paid girl. Jules is about to reject her, and then Pippa passes, singing a different song that speaks to Jules. He then decides to protect Fene so she doesn't fall back into the Madame Natalia's clutches. In the act Evening, we see Luigi and his mother in a deserted tower. We know that if Luigi stays in Asolo, he will be arrested and perhaps worse. He wishes to go to Austria to murder the Australian emperor. So the backdrop of the drama is ongoing battles between Italy and Austria at the time. Not knowing what will happen if he stays, his mother tries to convince him not to go. Then Pippa passes, singing another song, which gives Luigi the inspiration to leave for Australia, where he will undoubtedly commit murder, but at least not be arrested in Asolo. The final act is Night, in which we see the Monsignor conversing with his brother's murderer, who is also a robber, and this murder has left him the heir to much wealth. There seems to be a question here that Pippa might be the rightful heir of the Monsignor's brother. So the intendant, who's the murderer, has hatched a plot with the help of young prostitutes to lure Pippa into prostitution in order to dispose of her. Then Pippa passes, singing yet another song, and the Monsignor repents and calls for the arrest of the intendant. So in the final scene, which is also in the act Night, Pippa is back in her shabby chamber, getting ready for bed, having imagined those around her experiencing great happiness. But this is what she says. "Oh, what a drear, dark close to my poor day." So this belies any notion that Pippa is naively happy in this drama. She also expresses the wish that she had the capacity to move people. And the irony is that she really did move them, just probably not in the way that she had anticipated or hoped for. But hers is a rather passive effect. She merely passes by, unaware that they notice her. Another irony here is the desperation that is driving most of the people that she imagines are very happy. And it's important not to simplify Browning's work, which completely embraces a complex moral ambiguity. He's not saying Pippa's happier than they are. She is not. She's living in extreme poverty. She toils 364 days a year. She has one day holiday. She is noticed by the characters in the background as a sad and ragged figure. And she is admittedly thus. Browning's final message of the drama seems to be for his audience. Pippa has one final song in her chamber by herself. All service ranks the same with God whose puppets, best and worst, are we. There is no last or first. So it's a very democratic message. Adama, Jules, Luigi, Monsignor may seem happier to Pippa because they have love, wealth, privilege, authority, all the reasons she ascribes happiness to them. But they are really no better off than the exploited child laborer whose life is at least free from the type of immoral behavior they've engaged in. While the snippet, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, seems inspiring and comforting, in its context, it is highly ironic at best and devastating in reality. I've argued about other Montgomery novels that Montgomery provides the ending the reader so desperately wants. So if you think about Leslie and Owen getting together at the end of House of Dreams, for example, But she put something in to discomfit us, to shake the easiness of the ending, to point out that life isn't as neat and tidy as such fictions are. And so I'm arguing here that she places these words at the end of this narrative to provide a gloss on Anne's story. Like Pippa, Anne is an orphan. She is entirely dependent on those around her. Like Pippa, she chooses to imagine the world a happy place, and in doing so, it becomes a bit happier in the moment. But as Epperly suggests, Montgomery embeds a caution here as well. The world isn't really a happy place. Anne was in an orphanage and unable to speak directly about her childhood homes because they were so awful. And you'll remember, and this is a quotation, Marilla was shrewd enough to read between the lines of Anne's history and divine the truth. Anne is struck by pity for Anne early on in words that could describe Browning's Pippa. Quote, what a starved, unloved life she had had, a life of drudgery and poverty and neglect. But I'm going to come back to that. Very importantly, Marilla and Matthew wanted to adopt a boy orphan in the first instance in order to perform free labor on the farm, which was why a girl was useless. This comparison with the child laborer Pippa is certainly a moment exposing that uncomfortable and arguably unethical practice, which was not uncommon in Canada at the time. Montgomery is not simply giving her readers an inspirational mantra to hold on to in anxious and worrying times, as Gamble would suggest. Rather, she's reminding her readers of the stark reality that brings Anne and Marilla to this point. Remember, without her brother, Marilla is likely to lose Green Gables without Anne to help her. Like Pippa, Anne has labored without much return, but she learns to be grateful and use her imagination to transcend her circumstances. So let's go back to these final lines again. Her imagination is how she can transcend her circumstances. Montgomery writes on the end of that first paragraph, nothing could rob her birthright of fancy or her ideal world of dreams. And I find that really interesting language to use here. Nothing could rob her of her imagination. So again, the stealing kind of element there. And it gives the impression that even though everything else is taken, she will always have her imagination. And Montgomery is careful to highlight the constraints around her heroine. Anne's horizons had closed in since the night she had sat at her window after coming home from Queens. But if the path set before her feet was to be narrow, she knew that flowers of quiet happiness would bloom along it. Sorry, I just lost my place. Is this a moment of finding contentment in a narrower path? Is it resignation? Is it capitulation to the status quo? Or is it an active positive response to her circumstances? What choice does she have here? And what are her options? And what is Montgomery trying to tell us about the lives of little girls and young women? Importantly, at the end of Pippa Passes, Pippa's returning to her mundane, endless, repetitive labor. So what is Montgomery saying by having Anne echo Pippa's words and life? I do see it as stealth feminism. Anne fits in and perhaps is a bit pruned down, but she has changed the status quo. Both the world of Avonlea and the girl's story tradition. So she's changed the status quo, both within the novel, Avonlea, and then the girl's stories tradition, in a similar way that Pippa affects those she passes by. However, Montgomery is also then reminding her knowing reader that the world is not ideal, even in this supposedly happy girl story. I find it even more interesting that one of the most recent adaptations picks up on the darkness that has always been there, but is often overlooked. If we read backwards through that adaptation as well, we can more fully embrace the complexity that Montgomery created in Anne of Green Gables. From the beginning, as I mentioned, Anne of Green Gables has been adapted for the stage and screen, especially since the novel's centenary in 2008. and Montgomery's works fell into the public domain in Canada in 2012. There has been a veritable explosion of Anne of Green Gables adaptations and remakes. In 2016, Breakthrough Entertainment debuted a 90-minute made-for-television movie, Ella Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, and that was followed by 2 sequels in 2017, for example. And then add in the abundance of Anne films, musical animations, print reinterpretations, including Montgomery's own sequels, and a whole lot of different Annes are competing for audiences and for cultural primacy. And one stands out for me, both because of the dark content, but also because of the unbridled passion that the fans evinced, and I'm happy to talk about that later. And that's the CBC Netflix television series, Anne with an E, written by Moira Walley-Beckett. And this series arguably reads backwards, returning to the novel to foreground the narrative of trauma that was always already there. In my opinion, Walley-Beckett heeds the warning that Pippa's words convey. So this little moment of plug. I've written about this television series in an essay entitled Anne with an Edge, which will be published by McGill Queen's University Press on the 15th of October in Children and Childhoods and Ella Montgomery Continuing Conversations. So in order to understand why I feel that Walley-Beckett heeds the warning that Pippa's words convey, let's step back and look at the background on the production of the show. So the writer of the entire first season, Walley-Beckett, is a Canadian actor and award-winning screenwriter who wrote many episodes of the dark television show Breaking Bad. Look at it, even looks very ominous, about a high school teacher turned crystal meth producer, and she won an Emmy for one of the shows that she wrote. She contracted with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, to produce a new version of Anne as a television show. Much of the early media attention focused on the unlikely pairing of the crime story Breaking Bad with the wholesome Anne of Green Gables. Netflix got on board afterwards, but it's largely seen as a co-production. Until the second season, Netflix CBC and Netflix Canada and Netflix International have had different titles for the show. So in Canada and on Netflix Canada, it was called just Anne. And then for Netflix International, it was Anne with an E. And marketed it slightly differently. As you can see in these pictures, the Canadian version is not a fancy, pretty one, and the everyone calls it the American version, but it's the Netflix International version. Is a very photoshopped, prettyified version, and I can talk about that later if you'd like. Then in Canada, in the second season, it was just Anne with an E, and no one even acknowledged that it had a different title in the first season. So general consensus in the media and general public is that this television show is very different than the precursor text, than Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables. Whether reviewers find it terribly wrong, as Vanity Fair declares or not, they all speak to the reboot or refresh or updating or reinvigoration of the novel by the new series. And Walley-Beckett herself admits that she went almost completely off book in writing the series and focused on, in her words, drawing out the darkness. While Joanne Robinson's scathing review in Vanity Fair exclaims that Netflix's heroine is Anne with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, many Montgomery scholars have understood the deep trauma that underwrites the supposedly sunshiny novel, as we have just been discussing. Catherine Slater's article on trauma in Anne of Green Gables argues that readers' fascination with the novel, and this is her words, is fundamentally connected to the pleasures of witnessing Anne's active healing from early childhood trauma, her movement from isolated fantasy to productive social relationships within an embracing community, unquote. Montgomery sets the stage for identifying Anne's distress early on, particularly when Anne recounts her background pre-Green Gables to Marilla. And so keep poor orphaned Pippa in mind here as well. So this is Anne's background. Orphaned at 3 months, passed off to the poor cleaning woman, Mrs. Thomas, who had a drunk husband and 4 children. Anne's earliest years embody suffering and neglect. After Mr. Thomas dies when she's 8, Anne is taken in by Mrs. Hammond, who has 8 children. When Anne is 10, Mr. Hammond dies and Anne is sent to the orphanage. This history is simply recounted by Anne, rather than something the reader witnesses. It occurs offstage, so she's just telling Marilla about it. When Marilla asks if the women were good to Anne, Anne responds, "Oh," faltered Anne. Her sensitive little face suddenly flushed scarlet, and embarrassment sat on her brow. "Oh, they meant to be. I know they meant to be just as good and kind as possible." So the knowing reader and Marilla understand that they were not. Similarly, not only was Anne's sole friend her own reflection, Katie Morris, a detail that highlights her neglect, but the fact that the bookcase with no books had only one pane of glass because, quote, Mr. Thomas smashed the other one night when he was slightly intoxicated, reveals the alcoholism and violence that were simply the norm for her. So even rigid and cold Marilla understands Anne's neglect, as I mentioned earlier. She looks at Anne when Mrs. Blewett suggests she take her to mind her children and, quote, softened at the sight of the child's pale face with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it escaped. Certainly the Cuthberts keep Anne out of a sympathy born from understanding the trauma she had endured. "We might be some good to her," Matthew responds when Marilla explains that Anne is of no use to them. Montgomery underscores that identifying the trauma is not necessarily straightforward. By showing Marilla finally grasping Anne's reality, as I mentioned before, and this, I'll repeat this quotation, what a starved, unloved life she had had, a life of drudgery and poverty and neglect. For Marilla was shrewd enough to read between the lines of Anne's history and divine the truth. By aligning the reader with Marilla, hearing Anne's tale, Montgomery thus encourages her readers to imagine more than Anne reveals and to understand themselves that trauma is often not readily apparent. Her treatment of trauma is gentle and nuanced as she gestures towards Anne's traumatic past, but skirts directly confronting the reader with it. Enter Wally Beckett. With the transition from print to small screen, Anne's history takes a different bent. The generic conventions of the visual require a dramatization of Anne's earlier life, which Kevin Sullivan's 1985 television miniseries did by beginning the story with Anne's child labor in the 2 impoverished and twin beset families. However, Wally Beckett creates a particular focus on pain and suffering. She explains in an interview with Willa Paskin that she's fascinated by trauma. "I am drawn to the psychology of wounded people," she admits. Thus, she focused on drawing the darkness out of Anne's books. In an interview with Amy Wilkinson, she says, "All the darker aspects of the story are inherently in the book, so I'm not actually reinventing the wheel. I'm just taking us there. Because what happens in the novel is it's dealt with sort of in passing in conversation as Anne has. I wanted to dramatize it, and I wanted it to feel visceral. I wanted you to know exactly what her origin story was so that we could really understand her original wounding and the stakes that were at play for her. It was all there. I just dug it out." Indeed, Wally Beckett explains in an interview with Joanna Schellner, that, and this is her words, "I read between the lines to mine what isn't there, but has been there all along," unquote. And that places her in a parallel position with Montgomery's Marilla and the reader reading between the lines of Anne's history. Wally Beckett rereads the past in order to highlight the trauma by imbuing not just Anne, but each character with distinct and unhealed trauma, one that is easy to imagine was there all along. Through many flashbacks triggered by something in the present, the viewer sees Anne beaten, bullied, verbally abused, and living in violent and impoverished conditions. Anne is clearly haunted by her past. Wally Beckett improvises on the backstories of many characters in order to amplify the underlying trauma. Marilla and Matthew had an older brother who faced an untimely death, which had a negative, if unarticulated, impact on both of their lives. The actor who portrays Marilla carries a worried and sensitive countenance, even if she bears that brisk exterior. This Marilla has had a disappointment in love, as poignant flashbacks make clear. Again, this is hinted at in Montgomery's text when Marilla confesses to Anne that Gilbert's father had been her beau, a confession embellished in the Sullivan miniseries. Wally Beckett invents another thwarted love when Matthew has flashbacks about his youthful love for Jeannie, the maker of the famous puffed sleeve dress. Moreover, Matthew's inevitable economic failure is due to some bad decisions on his part and the sinking of a ship carrying Green Gables produce, rather than the bankruptcy of the bank he had invested in, a change that places more responsibility for the failure on Matthew. The effects still wear on his health as he has a heart attack, but perhaps most off-script and dark, even more than grifters invading Green Gables, is Matthew's interrupted attempt at suicide. So Wally Beckett magnifies the trauma of other characters as well. Gilbert's father is bedridden and dies, leaving Gilbert an orphan, just like Anne. Here, Wally Beckett is foregrounding and elaborating a very small detail from the novel. Diana explains to Anne that Gilbert will soon be joining the class, and she says, 4 years ago, his father was sick and had to go to Alberta for his health, and Gilbert went with him. So that's all Montgomery says about this situation, and Wally Beckett takes that further. In the television series as well, the French boy Jerry must work instead of attend school, his deepest desire, because his family is so poor. Notably, Jerry has hardly any role in the novel, much less a speaking part. Wally Beckett's Miss Josephine Barry has recently lost her female life partner. This new Avonlea teems with grieving and wounded people. So Anne's appearance and her trauma enables them to begin to heal themselves. And again, think of Pippa passing by all the so-called happy ones and causing them to pivot and sometimes repent. Marilla pulls out old love letters after Gilbert's father dies and offers a teary smile, perhaps an indication that she's able to remember with affection. Matthew recounts his old flame Jeannie when he reconnects with his old flame Jeannie when he enlists her to create a dress for Anne. Jeannie then saves him from suicide. Miss Barry finds some solace in becoming Anne's role model, and Gilbert finds a sympathetic friend in his fellow orphan Anne after his father's death. This series shows a chronic woundedness, but also distinct possibilities for healing, notably centered around the orphan Anne. Writing about the novel, Slater discusses the healing impulse. And this returning motif, these are Slater's words, in this returning motif of trauma successfully surmounted, Montgomery affirms her commitment to reiterating the power of the symbolic order. Its repetition suggests she understands the hunger of many of her readers for witnessing over and over the same model that Catherine Sheldrick Ross identifies as pleasurable, the outsider's absorption into a safe and insular community. Unquote. In many ways, Wally Beckett heightens the impulse, this impulse that Slater identifies in Montgomery's novel by increasing the emphasis on trauma. The very fact that Anne is so frequently adapted shows a larger and ongoing social desire for the comfort and pleasure of this story of healing from trauma. What I think is important here is the focus on trauma and the unideal. Wally Beckett's version of Anne may seem to stray from Montgomery's novel, but in my opinion, at its heart, it stays true to the central impulse of the narrative. Indeed, if Montgomery echoes Browning, perhaps Wally Beckett is returning to Browning's more explicitly darker world, one with robbers, potential suicide, and grifters, with predatory teachers and domestic abuse, with bullying and prejudices and violence. Wally Beckett's Anne, like Pippa, is a vulnerable, exploited girl using her imagination and happiness to try to survive. And In all three versions of An Orphan Girl's Tale, Browning's, Montgomery's, and Wally Beckett's, the disenfranchised girl has more power than she realizes. But all three of them are a caution to the reader. The world is a dangerous and disappointing place. Wally Beckett's Anne with an E is arguably a call to action, as her Anne actively protests gender roles and engages in change-making. But then looking back at Anne through that lens enables to see that that change-making was there the whole time. And perhaps that's the most compelling reason we keep returning to Montgomery's delightful tale of the relentlessly cheerful redhead, particularly in these chaotic times. The message that an orphan's unflagging optimism and diligent work can transform outdated sexist attitudes and affect lasting change for women and humanity might just be the balm we need to carry on and fight another day. Thank you.